Hello and welcome to the Friday Five. I'm Mariana, Montessori educator, trained 0 to 6, parent coach, and parenting author. Every Friday, I do this live stream as a core component of the Montessori Masterclass, where families can engage in self-study lessons, one-on-ones, group support, podcasts, all kinds of ways for interactive dialogue around Montessori child development and education. In this live stream, you can bring your questions from the week and join me as I go through the Friday Five. So what is the Friday Five? Well, I talk about one Montessori toy, one conventional toy, one practical life idea, one children's book, and of course, answering a parenting question I find on the web this week. So if you're joining me live, feel free to pop your questions as we go into the chat, and I will happily discuss them. But let's get into it, the Friday Five. So we will start with our Montessori toy versus a conventional toy, pros and cons. So if you're new to this broadcast, the Montessori toy, conventional toy definition, I'm not focusing on specific areas of Montessori curriculum. I am really focusing on the idea that Montessori activities, materials, and toys are centering the child's development, whereas conventional toys are often centering the child's entertainment, or they're borrowing from developmentally centered activities and then without the why, without understanding what the development is being centered, are making a shift in the actual toy that makes it misaligned. And mirrors are a really good example of this. So babies love looking at themselves in a mirror. That's a really attractive activity for them. It's helpful for them as they develop their eyesight and to be able to start understanding, how their body moves, what they look like in their movements moving forward. So it tends to be a really great activity for children, and it's a really wonderful sort of activity, especially for something like tummy time. So when the child is laying on their tummy and they're working on strengthening their neck muscles and their shoulders, all of that, every time they lift up, they see a mirror. So in Montessori spaces, we don't put the mirror high above the child, we put it down to the floor, because the child who is on the floor will most likely be able to see it. So when you see mirrors in spaces, even if they're really Montessori aligned, if they're mounted above the baseboard, for example, a child who is quite young on their tummy on the floor is unlikely to be able to really see that. So a actual Montessori material would be to put that mirror on the floor. Another thing that you might see in a Montessori style mirror is that the mirror is quite large. So whereas conventional mirrors tend to be quite small, as pictured with a standard sort of baby mirror to your right and the Montessori mirror to your left. So the reason why it's quite large is just because the child is interested in a much wider space, and it depends on where their body happens to be looking to see which part of the mirror is going to be most interesting to them. So when you have a child who is young enough that they are still working on motor control of their neck, they're still working on trying to see how to turn my head this way or that intentionally, it's helpful to give them a much wider viewpoint or target area, because they don't know exactly which way they might be facing, and they can't exactly turn their head to look at the tiny little space that's being offered to them in some of these smaller baby mirrors. And the third thing that I would point out that's pretty common with Montessori style mirrors is that they are actually real mirrors, which means that it's giving a pretty accurate reflection of not only the child, but of the room around them, around the child. So the child is not going to be able to turn around and really face somebody who might be in the room. So if their parent comes in and they're excited to see them, it's not going to be for many months that the child is going to be able to actually turn around to really see them. But with a mirror, they actually might be able to engage in where that sound is coming from and who just came into the room. So when you have these sort of baby mirrors that are distorted, they're not real mirrors, it's a lot harder to see an accurate reflection of the space. And usually the reason why the baby mirrors are set up in that way with that sort of distorted look is just simply because of the material that's being used, that it's not breakable. So we do, in Montessori spaces, we do want to make sure that children are safe, and we do tend to use real things sort of across the board, even if they are breakable. We obviously have safety as our priority. And the reality is if we mount a mirror to the wall, the child isn't going anywhere for a while. So it's not the safety risk of a real mirror for a child who isn't mobile is very, very low. And they're usually not right next to the mirror, right? They're sort of situated a little bit back from the mirror itself. So they are not themselves engaging with the mirror in a tactile way that it seems like the conventional mirror is really set up for. It's set up for the baby kind of exploring with it, in which case they're not getting an accurate representation of their room because of the distorted reflection. They're also moving it around. So who knows? It could be face down. It could be upside down over here. It could be over here. So it's not a reliable toy. It's not a reliable reflection of the environment, and it's quite small. So for the child to really target their attention to that small of an area tends to be challenging. So in the example of, I forget which company it is, but there is a company that makes a play gym mat that is supposed to be Montessori inspired. And it's got all kinds of things going on the base of the mat. It's got one flap that has like black and white stuff, and it's got one flap that has one of these sort of conventional mirrors, and it's got another flap that's got something else. That style of playmat is not only a very overstimulated space to sort of have all in one, but it's also providing that same conventional mirror. It is along the floor, but it is that conventional mirror of a distorted image, a smaller mirror, and it's not reliably there. Whereas if we were going to really think about the things in the environment are meant to inspire the child to move more, inspire them in their environment, then we want to make sure that the environment is predictable and stable. We mount the mirror too close to the floor. It's a real mirror that the child can really see, and it's a wide enough mirror that they can see a large part of the room. All of those things are going to inspire the child to want to look up more, to use the mirror more, and be excited. One last addition here is that you'll see there's a bar along the mirror in the Montessori sort of mirror, the one on the left. And that is for eventually, once the child is pulling to stand, it can be really helpful again for them to be able to see that motor transition of using the bar to pull up on and then being able to see their full body. This might not be practical for a lot of families in the home to get this particular mirror, which is fine. The child is going to be able to pull up on whatever's available, whether it be the couch or an ottoman or a chair. And they don't need to have the mirror with the bar. And also families can DIY it a little bit by having a mirror and then adding something like mounting a curtain bar or a towel bar as a way on either side of a mirror. So that's another way that you could do it. The time that the child is really looking for something to aid them in pulling themselves up is they get to pulling up and then they get to cruising. So where they feel a little bit more stable. So the child is also able to sometimes use the wall itself to pull up on. And so you may not need to get certainly a mirror with the bar mounted. It could just be a standard closet mirror that's a full length mirror that you just turn on its side and mount below the baseboard. So that's a little bit about the mirror. The progression of this mirror is often when the child is laying on their back and doing tummy time. This is a great time to be using the low horizontal mirror. Once the child is sitting up, they still might be interested in looking at the mirror, but they're usually engaged in looking down at their hands. So they still like the mirror, but you're going to see them do a lot more handheld toys after they're sitting. And then once they're crawling, they're not staying in a stationary play area. They're going everywhere. So they use the mirror a lot less once they're crawling, unless you have this bar and then they're using it to pull up on. But one of the things that you can do after crawling is you can remount the mirror not the one pictured with the bar, but if you got a horizontal standard sort of mirror, one that goes like on the back of a door or something like that, if you had it horizontally mounted, you can unmount that and then mount it vertically, and that can be moved to near the child's changing area, because by the time they're pulling to stand, this is also a time when you can start introducing a standing diaper change. So you can repurpose the mirror that they're not really using anymore in their play space and put it in vertically in their changing area, so that you can start to do a standing diaper change in front of a mirror. They can start doing changing clothes in front of a mirror, and it just becomes the way that we use full length mirrors, is we use them to check our progress in putting clothes on. So we're checking our work. And so that's what the child uses later. So that is a very common way for families to use and reuse that mirror, because then it's not a poor investment. You use it while they're young for exactly the interest that it derives, and then you move it vertically, and then they use that just as the clothing mirror forevermore. That can just be their mirror. I still have my kids' old floor length low horizontal mirror that's now been put vertically, and that's just their 8 years old and 5 years old, and they just use that as their standard mirror for self-dressing. And they will for a long time, because it's a long horizontal mirror. So those are some ideas and things to think about. Another space where mirrors are often used is in a car. If you use a car for transportation, is that there will be a mirror sort of mounted on the back headrest, so that that you can kind of see what's going on for the child. If they're really upset while you're driving, you're gonna, through your rear view mirror, you might be able to see into that mirror, which then shows you what's going on with the child. And if there's something blocking, sort of obviously wrong, you'd be able to kind of see it, or you at least get a sense of what's going on back there. So sometimes families will use mirrors that way. I think those are mostly for the adult to see the child. It's kind of like one of those mirrors that they have for corners of roads. It's that you're using it to be able to see what's going on the other side, rather than it being a car toy for them. I mean, it's certainly, if they'd like to look at themselves, that's fine. But usually the position of the mirror is for the adult to be able to see the child. Most of those kind of mirrors, the mirror itself is higher quality than the baby mirror that is being pictured here on my slide. So the distortion is really minimized, even though it's not glass. So that particular mirror, even though it's a small area, it's mostly for the adult to kind of see what's going on for a rear-facing child. And it could be for the child if that's interesting to them. You could use it as, something they can see themselves while they're sitting, but it's up to you. Most of the time, I think it's really just for the driver, especially if you're in the car alone. If the child all of a sudden is really upset, for you to be able to check in without having to pull over and actually see what's going on. So, but if the child were to use it, it's less distorted. So it's definitely a higher quality mirror for the child to be able to use. So that is our little chat about mirrors. So hopefully, if you have a child who is young, or even if they're into toddler and preschoolhood, you can use a mirror as a self-dressing check like we do. Or if you have a very young child, you can consider mounting a low horizontal mirror in the child's space, and then repurposing it once they are mobile. So let's get on to it, to our practical life. So our practical life idea today is helping the adult prepare food. So food preparation is a really big topic in the life of humans, right? So we do not, like other species might, capture an animal and then eat the animal, or eat plants directly from wherever they are growing. What we do as humans is we prepare food. So we can walk up to an apple tree, pick the apple, and then eat the apple. So there's some foods that we can eat directly from the environment, but by and large, our food is prepared. even raw food is prepared in often in some way. So whether we are cooking it or mixing things together or baking or doing other things with food, is there is going to be some preparation. So it is a regular practical skill for children to be involved in, because this is going to be a life skill that they need to know how to prepare food for their own sustenance. So, as the child is learning, there's a lot of steps and there's a lot of tools. And we know that some people actually go to school for this, right? So, people go to school for culinary school and become chefs, and they learn how to prepare food, and they learn the difference between all different kinds of knives and all different kinds of tools, much more than a layperson who just knows how to cook a little bit. So there's going to be cultural ways of cooking. There's going to be special tools for certain foods. There's going to be potentially an option for this being a professional career path. So there's lots of applications. And I think that for children, the important thing is that we understand that there's a lot of tools that the child is trying to navigate. So they do need to know something about the tools. They need some opportunity to learn a little bit about the tools and the sequence. So those are the two things that we can help the child with as they learn. I think sometimes when families think about food preparation, especially with their toddlers are very interested in following us around and doing what we do. And when we're in the kitchen, they want to be right up there. And I think sometimes when we think about that, we say, okay, I'm going to involve my child in cooking. And then it is the absolute worst. It is really difficult to actually involve them in cooking. It's not actually that helpful. It's really messy. And part of that is that we're sort of launching them into a really big ask of trying to manage all of these tools and all of these steps. And what's really helpful is if we can give them activities to do that either center the tools or center the steps, and just slow play it. So they don't have to help with everything, but they can help with something. So in the example of the illustration that's being pictured is there's lots of things here that we can see. So there's salad that is in a salad spinner that has been washed. There's tomatoes that have been cut. There's a jar of possibly olives that has been added to the salad. There's cucumbers that have been cut. There's the adding of the salad dressing. There's carrots that have been washed and cut. So what of those things could the child possibly do for the age that they are? Is it possible that if the adult prepares the salad and puts it in the salad spinner, could the young toddler push the salad spinner down over and over and over until the salad is spun while you're cutting the tomatoes? Is that a possibility? Or is it a possibility that the child could rinse the leaves and they could actually be the washer of the leaves while you're working on some other things? Or, if it's large leafy greens, whether, it's whatever kind of lettuce or kale or chard or whatever is being used, could the child, as a 2-year-old who may like to tear things up, could they tear apart those things? Is that, instead of having to cut the greens or the leaves, could they actually just tear it up? And would that be sufficient for the salad? The child is probably going to struggle with using all of the tools, but can we give them some special tools that accommodate their lack of accuracy, but by keeping them safe? So we're not going to give them a large chopping knife, but could we give them a wavy chopper? Could we give them something that is going to be effective at chopping, but safe in case they miss what they're doing? And then if we're giving them something to chop, do they have the force and the power and the strength to push down and chop a big part of the whole cucumber? Or are they going to chunk it into this enormous piece that we have to sort of redo? Could we cut the cucumber into quarter slices first that end up looking like pickles, and then give it to the child to sort of chop, because any of those sizes would probably work out okay? Or is there a way that the child is chopping their vegetable, whether it's the carrots or the cucumber, into a communal bowl, and you're chopping next to them by taking things out of that bowl that are really large and leaving the ones that are small, and then adding yours back in? So is that a system that could be done? Or could the child be the one that adds the dressing? right? Like we might think, oh no, I don't want to have them do that because if I give them the dressing bottle, they're going to pour the whole thing in and that's going to be too much dressing. So then what do we have to do to prepare for that? Could we give them the correct amount of dressing in a jar or a cup or a measuring cup and then have them pour that in? So they do pour the entire container, but they're not pouring too much. So there's lots of different ways that a child can participate. They do not have to do the whole thing, but the focus would be on, are we giving them access to tools so they can learn how this works? And are we giving them access to the sequence? So the sequence of steps would be something like, we have to wash things before we cut them. We have to do, one thing before the other. Those kinds of things can be really helpful. And we can do this often. It works the best if we're doing this side by side with the child. That's going to be the most effective. But we also can have them do some things like chopping while we're starting something on the stove. That is possible to achieve. And as the child gets older, they can take on more and more and more of the project. So as the child is in their primary years, so 3, 4, 5, they can start doing more of the process. So we say, okay, great. You're 5-year-old, so you can wash the cucumber, bring it back to this cutting area, have your knife, you have the full strength to cut it. And then you're going to cut it twice. You're going to cut the round, and then you're going to cut it again where it's in half or maybe in quarters. And so that child being 5 would be able to manage those steps while you're doing something else. And then eventually, once they're 6, there are different versions of what is appropriate in terms of having the child actually engage with the oven and the stove. And certainly in certain circumstances and certain cultures, kids are having access to that much earlier, but probably not much earlier than 3, but somewhere after 3, 4, 5, we're going to start probably feeling more comfortable with the child engaging in certain things. Maybe it's an appliance. Maybe it's the toaster or the toaster oven or a blender or something like that. And maybe it's learning how to turn the stove on and talking to them about stove safety. And if they can't hack it, if they leave the stove on because they forgot to turn it off, then obviously then we have to go back a step. So helping the adult prepare food has a lot to do with the steps and the tools. And the last thing I'll say just about tools is, if you've never been to culinary school, there are so many things that you probably have no idea, not only what they do, but you don't even know what they're called. You've never even seen them before. And so the process of learning, we use language to sort of identify and clarify what we're talking about. And so language is a really big part of the process. So if I was learning something new from a friend of mine who's like in the culinary world, and they were telling, all they said was, first you pick up this, and then you pick up that, and then you're going to use this other thing. If they never used the language for any of those terms, it'd be so much harder to understand. So some of the work towards food preparation and working with the adult for food preparation has a lot to do with language, which we can do outside of the actual cooking. So we don't have to wait until we're actually needing to cook something in order to teach the child language around it. So it's very common in Montessori spaces to have object baskets, especially for toddlers, to be able to have a basket that has kitchen tools in them that are safe. So things like a spatula, things like a whisk, things like a wooden spoon, for them to just explore and for us to play with them, but have us share the language. This is a spoon, this is a whisk. So by the time they actually are preparing food, they have an idea of what we're talking about, and we can aid them in understanding by using language. And the last thing about food that I was just thinking of sharing is, sometimes kids, they can help prepare food at the counter level, which means they need some kind of step up if they're going to start in toddlerhood. Might be something like a learning tower, might be something like a step stool, whatever works to sort of help them be at the counter height. Or we can have a small table and chair this dimension to them in the kitchen area, where the food preparation is dimensioned to their height. So either they're being aided to reach our height, or we're giving them something at their height. Often if you think about, do you sit down and prepare food? Sometimes, sometimes if we're shucking a lot of corn, I'm going to sit down to do that. But a lot of food preparation is done standing. So when you think about dimensioning a kitchen table to the child, you might consider thinking of something higher than you would with a chair. You could add a chair if that's helpful, but you also might consider having something that is at the child's standing height so that they can stand and chop. And there are some really high quality adjustable chairs, adjustable tables that are really high quality that are super simple to go up or down. And that might be something to sort of think about, is to have something that can work in both, that you can adjust it higher if they're standing or lower with a chair if you're sitting. All right, so let's get to our book. So this is a favorite book of mine. I love Christian Robinson's books. He's got a couple. There's one, I think it's called Another. Yes, it is. It's one of my favorite. It's a book about opposites, but it's also got a story. So Christian Robinson has a lot of stories with few words and really fantastic illustrations. And You Matter is a wonderful book. His illustrations are very playful. He's very interested in storytelling, and it's really just it's a great book about affirmations, about helping the child, giving them language around self-affirmations. So You Matter and other Christian Robinson books are really lovely. He's a great illustrator and has really good storytelling. So this has been a fan favorite in our household. Oh, and it's a good for all ages. So even picture books, they can last for a long time when you have a high quality illustrator and a high quality author. So this can be something that you're reading to the child, as usually when the child is sitting upright, that's when they actually might be interested in books, because this is not in what do you call those kinds of books? A board book. It's not in a board book sort of setup. It's in a paper hardcover with actual pages. So I wouldn't hand this to a 6-month-old, but that doesn't stop us from reading it to the 6-month-old. So we might be able to see what they do with it, but we don't want them to crinkle the pages and learn to sort of damage books, because they don't have the motor control not to do that, which is where board books come in handy. But you can read it to them, and then this is certainly applicable all the way through elementary. It's just a lovely book, and sometimes it's nice even for older children to be read more simplistic books. It's very sometimes it's very enjoyable. It can be nostalgic, but it also just has really simple messages that feel good. So You Matter is a great book for all ages. All right, so now we're at our parent questions. If you're joining me live, feel free to ask your own questions on any of these topics and more, and I'm happy to address them. So our parent question is, what do you think about having a play kitchen set up in a home or center? So this is a great question because it is a hot topic in the Montessori world, and certainly in the parenting community, of trying to understand what's wrong with play kitchens. My kid loves it. So what's the deal? And why in Montessori spaces will you tend to not see play kitchens? So there's a couple things that I would say about this. The first is, if you gave the child, well, let's start with the development. We just talked about having kids help in the kitchen, because it is a life skill to know how to prepare food, because humans don't just go and eat food. we tend to prepare most of our food. So it's a life skill. It's a human skill that we have. And having the child learn these skills is all about what's happening in the first 3 years, is they're learning all these life skills. They're learning the life skill of toileting and self-dressing and self-nourishment and food preparation. They're going to get better at them after 3, but they're really getting these core foundational understandings before then. So it is developmentally aligned that the child would be interested in food preparation. So that's the development. That's what we know. So if you give the child the option to prepare real food or fake food, they are most likely going to pick real food. So if we have the option to say, offer them developmentally appropriate ways to engage in a real kitchen versus a play kitchen, in Montessori, it seems like a pretty obvious choice that rather than giving them a play kitchen, we're going to give them a real kitchen with developmental access alongside object baskets that give them access to some of the tools in kitchens, the names of those tools, help them kind of engage with language and the exploration of objects as real objects, a real spatula, a real wooden spoon, so that they learn more about what to take into their food preparation knowledge. So that's sort of the first idea, is that if we had a choice, and so in Montessori centers and in Montessori homes, there tends not to be a play kitchen because we're allotting for the child to engage in real work in the real kitchen. We're inviting them in to that community space of preparing food. So that's sort of the reason why, is that Montessori, we know that developmentally the child is looking for what's real. They're looking to build real skills in the real world. And they are going to sort of lean towards that. So based on observation of the child and giving them choice, we see them choosing these real things as opposed to things that don't work, right? They're going to be interested in things that do work rather than don't work. Then the question is, okay, well, if I can't accommodate the child in food preparation, or even if I can, but I still really want to get a play kitchen, is there anything wrong with a both and kind of approach? And I'd say a couple of things. So one is play kitchens can have real equipment, like a real wooden rolling pin, a real sort of pot, like a stainless steel pot. They can have real items that are very similar to the object baskets that we have in Montessori that can be a really wonderful tool for language. So that can be really great. That is very true. And the child, what they need to do with these things, they need to explore with them so they understand the ins and outs of a spatula or a whisk or, whatever they're learning about. So exploration is going to be a big part of those. Language is going to be a big part. We want to make sure that those are well represented. So we're not looking for replicas of things. We're not looking for, a pot that actually isn't a pot. We're looking for something that is actually a potential tool for the kitchen that they can learn and grow from, right? So we're not going to say, all right, I'm going to teach you everything about what it means to be a dog by handing them a replica of a dog, because that's not going to give them the kind of information that they need. So if I say, okay, here's a dog and this is a dog and I'm going to call it a dog, and you've never seen another dog, but I'm going to keep telling you that this is a dog so that you can learn about it. Well, the dog is never moving. The dog doesn't react to me. It's rubber, so the fur it's not the same experience. I can knock it down. So a replica is it's not a good representation of the real thing. It's when the replica becomes a good representation when we have a solid understanding of what the real thing is, and we know that the replica is sort of an abstracted version of that. So if I have a ton of experience with dogs and then I have a replica figurine, then of course I can understand and extrapolate, okay, this is slightly different. But we don't want to start with the replica because that's not really a dog. It's a representation of something real. So that's where we get into a little bit of hot water with the kitchen, is that we get into some replicas. So we get into, either wooden or like rubber or plastic foods. So there'll be like a pizza, a plastic pizza, or there'll be like a wooden banana that's like pre-sliced with Velcro connecting the two. And then there'll be this like wooden knife that you slice through the Velcro to cut the banana. Those experiences, if you offered the child the opportunity to cut a real banana, number one, it's usually that the child would rather do that. But also they're getting a lot of wrong impressions about what it's going to be like to engage with these items, just like I was explaining with the dog. So it's going to be really different If a child has a mock representation of a red apple, and then they have a mock representation of a tomato, the child has to use that wooden cutter and cut through the Velcro in basically the same way, and they look really similar. Red round tomato, red round apple. But we know that in the real kitchen, we have to cut those very differently because the apple is much sturdier and the tomato is extremely soft. So we're going to have to engage with those in terms of the amount of pressure that we use, the angle that we're using to cut, even sometimes the kind of cutting equipment that we're using is going to be different between the tomato and the apple because of the difference between those two vegetables. So the child is not actually learning accurate things about the play kitchen items. So that ends up becoming, they're going down a road of learning skills of cutting Velcro in things that we're using incorrectly by saying tomato or apple. And they're just learning things that are not going to support the developmental skill of this life, this human life skill of preparing food. So those are some initial sort of thoughts around, number one, there can be some equipment that is being used in a play kitchen that is really great for language, and it's basically the equivalent. There's like a real wooden spoon, or there's real stainless pots, those kinds of things. Those can be great. We start to get into hot water when we're starting to have the child work with replicas, when they haven't had a turn to work with the real thing, like I explained about the dog. And then there's the child is actually practicing something, but they're practicing a skill that will ultimately not really be relevant and not serve them. So and the last thing I would say about the play kitchen is that it often will have the child engage with things that we wouldn't ever have them do in the real kitchen. So they're getting a misaligned understanding of what to expect. So their stove is never hot. Their faucet never turns on. You never have to make sure that the faucet is turned all the way off because there's no water ever coming out. You don't have to make sure that the stove is off because the stove is never on. I can basically open up the stove anytime I want. I can touch the top. I can put my dolly on top and nothing ever happens, which is not the right impression of how stoves work and what they're supposed to expect from the kitchen. I can leave the refrigerator door half open and it doesn't really matter. Whereas in the real kitchen, all those things do matter. You do have to make sure the tap is off. You do have to make sure the stove is off. You have to make sure the refrigerator's shut. So all of those things do actually matter, and they're part of the child learning limits, boundaries, and expectations in a space that we want them to be successful in. So that's why play kitchens are often not in Montessori spaces, and why you might consider having sort of opportunities for your child to engage in the real kitchen rather than having a play kitchen. And the last thing that I'll address is the idea of taking the basics of a play kitchen and making it real. So sometimes this is popular right now you'll see these, I mean, ridiculously adorable and beautiful little play kitchens that have been converted into a Montessori style kitchen for the child. Like there's actually water that comes out of the tap and it actually goes down the sink. And there's actually, cabinets that house foods and that they can prepare. The child has access to like a mini fridge. So they actually have real things in a real looking kitchen space. And this is very common in Montessori spaces to engage in that level of detail. So Montessori spaces often do have some kind of mini fridge or something that the child can access to get the food out, so that they don't have to sort of engage with a refrigerator or something that is dimension to the size of the adult, that the adult has maybe a fridge and then the children can access a small fridge. Or there's some other kind of ways that the child can engage with food preparation, whether it's a cabinet or anything. It doesn't have to be a fridge. But in terms of whether or not you need to add that to a home space, I would remember that at a Montessori school, what you're doing is you're preparing the entire space for the child. So the school might have a kitchen for the adult to do some food prep, but that's such an aside. The actual classroom for the child, you are creating for the children, and you have children that come through every single year. So the environment is used in that exact same way year after year after year after year. Whereas at home, we only have our kids for that time in their life until they move on. And yes, we could have another kid that goes through that stage, but there's a certain point when everybody moves on. So the investment feels a little lacking in terms of the longevity of using something that is so specific. Those kind of play kitchens in that way is really specific to toddlerhood. The primary age child, 3, 4, 5, they really can start to, they are going to outgrow something that's that dimension, that small. But the other thing that I would be thinking about is the community aspect of food. So when children engage in food in the home, it's about community, it's about culture, it's about chatting and sharing. Like the illustration showed, it's helping the adult with the task of preparing food. It's not an aside. So to have the child have this full kitchen makeup off over here has nothing to do with what the adult is doing. And I think that there's a missed opportunity there of, rather than converting a play kitchen to a real kitchen, of really just inviting the child into the kitchen in an age appropriate way. That is going to be the symbolic sort of inviting the child into community and culture through food, which is what we do as adults. Is we pass culture through food. We engage in community around food. So whether it's a happy event or a sad event or somebody just popping over, we tend to provide food during those times because it's a gelling of community. So we want to invite the child into a community around food instead of a separateness around food. So it's not just about their nourishment. And I think that in Montessori homes, because of those other developmental opportunities around engaging in community and culture, we see a lot more of bringing the child into the culture of food where you are, rather than having this high design, really elaborate sort of dimension to the child's size space that's separate and just for them. I think that those spaces make so much sense for Montessori programs, because not only is the adult, like, who's working there, they're supposed to be doing this with the child, so they already are in community with the child around food. But you also just, the space is very different. The space is many children going through, and they need to have independent access to a space that makes sense for them. Whereas at the home, there's a lot more going on with inviting the child to the family space. So for all those reasons, Montessori homes, you do not need a play kitchen, and you do not need to convert it to the child. There may be some things that you want to have the child have access to. So, that they don't always have to ask an adult for water, that they have some way of accessing water, whether that's, there's a pitcher somewhere on a little table, and they can always pour themselves water, or they have access to a stool and a sink. Or if you get a water source, that's perfectly fine. But to get the whole nine of all the kitchen elements that you sometimes see online that look beautiful, it's largely unnecessary, and it could be pulling the child away from some important community understandings and gellings around food. I would always remember that when we say that the child is making a connection with something, that is a literal thing to say. They're actually making a connection in the brain. And when we put two things together, they actually connect them. And so we want to put food and community together, because that is an important thing, that we don't want to put food and separateness together. That doesn't seem like that's aiding the child in their environment. So that is the end of the Friday Five. My name is Mariana Bissonette. I run the Montessori Masterclass with a whole team of Montessori trained educators from around the world, and where you can get self-study lessons, one-on-one support, and group support to help you answer your most pressing questions about Montessori. And you can join me every week in the Montessori Masterclass live stream right here on Fridays to get your questions answers as I go through the Friday 5. Thanks for joining me.